People ask me what it felt like to watch the pale margin hold the Harith corridor, and I never know how to answer them. They want something clean, pride, defiance, the bright edge of a thing done right against impossible odds. I understand why. It makes a better story that way. But I was there, and what I remember is the cost. I remember the weight of knowing exactly what we were doing and doing it anyway. I remember Ren Kavash's voice going quiet at the end of the second engagement pass and not coming back. I remember the pale margin's hull singing under two direct strikes, still transmitting, still holding, and thinking that the ship was going to die out here, and that Captain Turn had already decided it was worth it before the Dominion fleet ever dropped out of drive. The Varek Dominion conducted its 31st conquest assessment at the Harith corridor on the 14th of September, 2341. That's the date in the record. What the record doesn't say, and what I've been trying to say clearly for 22 years, is that they didn't win. They also didn't lose, not the way either side wanted. What happened in the Harith corridor was something else. Something the Dominion had no file for, no protocol for, no word for in any of their 31 languages. What happened was that a scientific survey platform crewed by 61 human beings looked out at 41 warships and said, "No, we were here first, and we are not moving." The Dominion went home. Kavash didn't. I've been working out how to say both of those things in the same sentence ever since. The pale margin was not a warship. I want to be precise about that because it matters to the story. She was built on an asymmetric survey platform, the Ferris-class design, which the Navy had been adapting for long-range intelligence runs since the late 2320s. The hull was irregular on purpose. One long spine of dense sensor arrays angled off a central core, with the drive section offset to port, and the crew habitation segment tucked under the sensor spine like a barnacle on a whale. She was ugly in the way working ships are ugly. Her profile on a visual scan was strange and angular and hard to classify at a distance, which was part of what made her useful. Nothing about her read as a warship. Nothing about her announced capability. She had no gun turrets in the conventional sense. She carried 2-point defense clusters at the prow and stern, rated for close-range debris clearance and light anti-missile work, and that was the extent of her weapons profile on paper. What she actually had was the most sensitive passive sensor array in the 9th Fleet's inventory, a broadband signal processor that could map the drive emissions of 40 ships at a range of 90,000 kilometers and tell you their fuel state, their thrust variance, and the acoustic signature of every mechanical system running on every vessel in that formation. The pale margin had been built to know things. She had not been built to fight. The distinction would turn out to matter. Captain Yale Turn had requested the assignment personally. I didn't know that until afterward. What I knew at the time was that I'd received transfer orders to a special-purpose intelligence run, that I was being attached as escort pilot alongside one other interceptor to a long-range survey vessel, and that the run had a classified destination that I would be briefed on after reporting aboard. I'd done classified runs before. I wasn't worried. I showed up at Meridian Station's Dock 7 with my gear and my service record, and I walked up the pale margin's embarkation ramp, and I thought she was the ugliest ship I'd ever been assigned to, and that was before I knew what she was going to do. My wingman for the assignment was Lieutenant Ren Kavash, 9th Fleet Fighter Wing, third-year line officer with a service record that showed 2 combat deployments and no notable disciplinary events, and a personal assessment that said steady, technically precise, excellent situational awareness. I'd flown with him once before, briefly, a joint wing exercise 8 months prior, and my memory of that was of a pilot who flew like he thought. Not fast, not flashy, but every move had a reason, and the reasons were good ones. He was 31 years old and from a place on Kessel that was mostly farmland, and he had a particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who had grown up in places where the quiet was normal. We were briefed by Captain Turn on the second day out from Meridian. She held the briefing in the pale margined small conference room, which seated 12 and smelled of recycled air and spent electronics. Tern stood at the front of the room with a display behind her, and she told us what we were doing in the same way she apparently did everything, precisely, without theatrical framing, starting with the facts. The Varek Dominion was a sovereign empire that had been expanding through the Cell-Death Drift and adjacent sectors for approximately 300 years. They operated on a conquest assessment model. They identified regions of space with signs of technological activity. They sent assessment fleets to contact and evaluate the species present, and they processed the contacted species through a three-tier intake taxonomy. Tier 1, primitives, to be left alone or monitored. Tier 2, contact-capable non-threats, to be absorbed under Dominion administration. Tier 3, contact-capable threats, to be pacified. 31 assessments over 300 years, and the taxonomy had never failed to classify a species. The Ninth Fleet's intelligence section had been tracking Dominion assessment patterns for 18 months, based on the pale margin's prior survey run. The Harith corridor was the likely site of the next assessment. The timing window was now, and the Ninth Fleet's Director of Intelligence had made a decision about what to do when the assessment fleet arrived, a decision that had been worked through the command structure and approved at levels I wasn't cleared to know about. We were not going to let the Dominion assess us. We were going to assess them. Tern laid it out in flat tactical language. The pale margin would run dark in the Harith corridor for the duration of the transit window, passively mapping everything in range. When the Dominion assessment fleet arrived and came into transmission range, we would surface and broadcast the complete survey record, everything we'd mapped, including the assessment fleet itself, its formation, its drive signatures, its tactical configuration. We would then hold position in the corridor and refuse to yield. The intelligence section's assessment is that this sequence of events disrupts the Dominion's intake protocol at a fundamental level, Tern said. Their protocol depends on information asymmetry, on knowing everything about the contacted species while the species knows nothing about them. We eliminate that asymmetry in the first transmission. They arrive expecting to assess an unknown. They find a species that has already assessed them. She stopped. She looked at us in the way of someone who has said the important thing and is about to say the harder thing. The probability of stand-down without significant engagement is 72%, conditional on our holding position under any initial fire, she said. The remaining 28% involves a serious engagement. This ship is not a warship. We have 2 fighters as our combat element. I am not going to misrepresent the risk to you. The assignment is voluntary. Anyone who wishes to transfer off can do so when we reach the next relay station in 3 days. She paused. No one left, she said, and she seemed to have expected that but to have needed to say it anyway. Kavash and I talked about it that night in the small crew mess over bad coffee from the ship's galley. Not about whether we were staying, and we both knew it and didn't need to discuss it. We talked about the 72%. We talked about what the 28% looked like. We talked about what 2 Kestrel-class interceptors could reasonably do against a 41-ship Dominion assessment fleet, and we arrived at an honest answer, which was, not enough to win, but enough to make it matter. She's right about the protocol disruption, Kavash said. He was turning his coffee cup in his hands in a slow rotation that I would come to recognize as his thinking motion. If they depend on information asymmetry and we strip it away, it changes what they're looking at. They're not assessing an unknown anymore. They're assessing a species that already knows them. That's a different calculation. Different how? They have to account for what we might have done with 19 days of passive survey data, he said. Who we might have transmitted it to. Whether the Ninth Fleet is already moving on the basis of what we know about their formation. He set the cup down. We're not just telling them we're here, we're telling them they've already been seen. And then we hold the corridor. And then we hold the corridor, he agreed. I thought about that for a moment. That's either very smart or it's the last thing we ever do. Probably both, Kavesh said, and he smiled in the quiet way he did most things. We went dark on day 3 of the transit. Standard procedure. You shut down every active emission. You run on passive sensors only. You become a hole in space that nothing bounces off of. The pale margin was exceptionally good at this. Her hull coating was layered in the same absorbent composite they used on stealth platforms, and at any range beyond 40,000 kilometers, she returned almost nothing on active scan. Running dark, in the deep quiet of the Harith corridor, she was effectively invisible. Kavesh and I docked our interceptors in the pale margin's dorsal cradles and ran on her power for most of the transit. Our own drives would have lit up the corridor like signal flares. We slept in the fighter cradles, ate in the ship's small crew mess, and spent our off hours in the observation bay, watching the Harith corridor slide past through reinforced glass. I got to know the ship's crew over those first weeks. Not well, there wasn't time for well, but enough. Sova was the one I talked to most, because the sensor bay was adjacent to the fighter cradles and our schedules overlapped at odd hours. She was 40 years old and had been with the Pale Margin for 3 of her 4 years in service. She talked about the ship, the way people talk about something they've built a relationship with, which I found strange at first and then less strange as the days went on. She's fast, Sova told me once, meaning the sensor processing, meaning the speed at which the passive array chewed through raw data and built a picture. Most platforms this size run a 6-second processing lag at extreme range. She runs under 2. She said it the way you say something you're proud of about a person. Hellas I saw mostly at meals. He was the executive officer, 50 years old, methodical in the way of someone who had been refining the same habits for a long time. He ran the ship's daily operations with a quietness that I came to understand was deliberate. He was the kind of XO who manages by making the captain's decisions visible and then executing them without friction. He never editorialized about what we were doing. He answered questions directly and did not ask them unless he needed to. The rest of the crew went about their work. The Pale Margin was a working ship and her crew worked it, maintenance cycles, sensor calibration, navigation checks, the 1,000 small tasks that keep a vessel running clean when it's running dark. There was a quality of concentrated purpose to the ship in those early days that I've thought about since. 61 people inside a steel hull in the dark, doing their jobs, knowing what was at the end of the corridor. No theater about it. No raised voices. Just the work done right, one shift at a time. It was beautiful in the way all deep space is beautiful, pitiless and enormous and lit, by a light that had been traveling for thousands of years to reach you. The Harith corridor ran through a region the charts labeled the Cell-Death Drift, a loose scattering of ancient debris from a system that had failed to coalesce maybe 3 billion years ago. The debris field was thin enough to transit without real hazard but dense enough to scatter ambient light in ways that made the corridor glow faintly blue at certain angles. On the 7th day, I sat in the observation bay for 2 hours just watching it. Kavesh came and found me. He was younger than me by 4 years, which put him at 31, and he had the quality some young officers have of being very still when they're thinking. He sat down next to me, and we watched the drift for a while without talking. "You think they'll come," he said eventually. "Tern thinks they'll come." "That's not what I asked." I thought about it. "I think they'll come," I said. "They've got 31 of these, it's routine for them. They drop in, they run intake, they process whatever they find." "And we're what they find." "We're what they find." Kavesh was quiet for a moment. "The Pale Margin doesn't have guns." "She has the point defense clusters." "Those aren't guns." "No," I said, "they're not." He looked at the drift for a while longer. "We have guns," he said, meaning our interceptors. "We do." He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. The drift glowed faintly blue, and we watched it, and I thought about Captain Tern and the 72% and the 28%, and I thought about the 31 species the Dominion had processed before us, and I wondered what those species had thought when the assessment fleet arrived. whether any of them had had time to think much at all. The drift had been here for 3 billion years, give or take. The debris of a failed system, scattered across the corridor, still faintly luminous with the slow decay of old materials. I found it comforting in a strange way. The corridor had been here before the Dominion, and before whatever species had preceded them, and it would be here after all of this. Whatever happened in the next few days, the corridor would continue to glow faintly blue. What I didn't say to Kavesh, what I barely said to myself in those middle days of the transit, was that I'd started to understand why Tern had asked for this ship specifically. The pale margin had a quality that I don't know the right word for. Running dark for 19 days in a corridor claimed by a sovereign empire that had processed 31 species, without losing one, is the kind of thing that could make you feel very small and very temporary, and maybe that was the expected feeling. But I didn't feel small in the pale margin. I felt watched over, which sounds strange, because the ship was the watcher. She was mapped and she was mapping and she was quiet about both, and there was something in that which I found steadying. On the 12th day, I ran a full pre-flight check on my interceptor, not because it needed it, but because the movement felt grounding. I checked the rail mounts, the missile hardpoint, the sensor pod, the ejection system, the drive variants at each thrust setting, everything in specification. Everything ready. Afterward, I sat in the cockpit for a while with the canopy open and the hangar bay's ambient light on the hull, and I thought about the 28%. Not with dread, with precision. I wanted to be clear on what it meant, what it looked like, what I would do in it. I ran through the engagement scenarios we'd briefed. If the Dominion fired first, our job was to keep them occupied, force their fire control to split its tracking between multiple fast-moving targets, give the pale margin the seconds and minutes she needed to keep transmitting. We were not expected to win the engagement. We were expected to make the engagement cost something, to make the cost visible, to give the Dominion a reason to recalculate whether the intake protocol was worth completing. I wondered, sitting in the cockpit in the hangar bay's quiet, whether the Dominion's 31 prior species had ever forced that recalculation, whether any of them had made the Dominion pay something real before they fell. The intelligence section's files on the Dominion's prior assessments were thin. Most of what we knew came from intercepted communications and second-hand accounts from species operating at the edges of Dominion space. But the broad picture was clear enough. The Dominion had not been required to fight hard for their assessments. The species that ran were easy to process. The species that fought and lost were logged under Tier 3 and the record closed. No species had made the intake protocol expensive enough to be worth stopping. That was what the 28% was for, not to win, to be expensive. "We should get some sleep," Kavesh said. "Yeah," I said. We sat there for another hour. On the 19th day, the pale margin's passive arrays picked up the first drive emissions. I was in the fighter cradle running a maintenance cycle on my interceptor's sensor pod when the alert came through, not an alarm, just a low tone that meant the watch officer wanted my attention. I sealed the pod, climbed down the service ladder, and went to the bridge. The bridge of the pale margin was small and dense with equipment. Consoles packed tight, displays running in multiple layers, the sensor operators sitting with their faces close to their screens like people reading something they needed to understand very precisely. Captain Tern was standing at the central display when I arrived, and she didn't look up. 41 contacts, said Senior Analyst Myra Sova, the pale margin's lead sensor officer. She was pointing at the display with one hand and working a secondary console with the other. Drive signatures consistent with Dominion assessment configuration. They're at 340,000 kilometers and closing on a bearing of 271 relative. "Intake formation?" Tern asked. "Classic intake formation," Sova said. "Lead assessment vessel at point, 12 flanking ships in standard arc, 28 mass in the secondary wave, and I'm counting 3 that I can't classify cleanly, new hull type, possibly a recent addition to the assessment inventory." I looked at the display. The 41 contacts were rendered as amber markers in a three-dimensional grid, moving in the slow, deliberate way of a formation that was not in a hurry. The Dominion was not hurrying because the Dominion had never needed to hurry. They dropped into the corridor, they ran their intake, they logged their assessment, they moved on. They had done this 31 times. They knew how it went. Timeline to contact range, Tern asked. At current velocity, they'll be in transmission range in 6 hours. In weapons range in 9. Tern nodded. She still hadn't looked at me. Davin, she said, I want you and Kavesh ready to launch at 6 hours minus 30 minutes. Understood, I said. Captain, what are we launching for? She looked at me then. Tern was 54 years old, compact and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered by long transits into something harder than it had started out. She had spent 11 years on long-range intelligence runs, and 4 before that on fleet combat deployments, and she carried the combination of those things in the way she held herself, still and precise, and not inclined toward reassurance. We surface when they're at transmission range, she said. We transmit the survey record, the full record, everything we've mapped for the last 19 days, including their own formation as it currently stands. We hold position in the corridor. We do not yield the corridor. I waited. If they respond to the transmission and stand down their approach, we stay on station and wait for the fleet to arrive. And if they don't, I said. If they don't, Tern said, we hold the corridor anyway. There is a particular quality to the 6 hours before a thing you cannot stop and are not sure you should stop. I've been trying to describe it for years, and the closest I've gotten is this. It feels like the space between a decision and its consequences. The decision is already made, you can feel that. The consequences are coming. What sits in the middle is very quiet. Kavesh and I spent most of those 6 hours in our fighters, running pre-launch checks that didn't need running, going through the sequences twice, and then 3 times because the movement of it was something to do with your hands. I talked to him on the short-range channel. Nothing important. Nothing about what was coming, just the ordinary back and forth of 2 pilots waiting. We talked about the drift, which was still visible through my cockpit glass, still faintly blue, still beautiful in that cold and indifferent way. We talked about the ship we'd both served on before this assignment, an old patrol cruiser called the Fenwick Reach that had been decommissioned the previous year. We talked about bad food and worse coffee, and a particular incident in the Fenwick Reach's engine bay that we'd both been present for, and that we'd never entirely agreed on the details of. At one point there was a long silence on the channel, and I thought he'd gone to check a system or taken off his headset, and then his voice came back, quieter than usual. If it goes the 28%, he said, I want you to know I understand why we're here. I waited a moment. I do too, I said. Not the assignment, he said. I mean here, the corridor, this specific place with this specific ship doing this specific thing. Tern could have put us in a destroyer and come in loud. She could have waited for the fleet. She sent a survey ship because the survey ship is the statement. It's not we have warships. It's we already knew you were coming and we came anyway with this. I thought about that for a while. You think the Dominion will understand that distinction? I think they'll understand it, he said. Whether it matters to them is the 28%. He went quiet again. I went quiet too. The drift continued to glow outside my cockpit glass, and I thought about what he'd said, that the survey ship was the statement, that the message was not capability but knowledge and the will to act on it. I thought about Tern requesting this assignment personally, and what that said about what she believed the Dominion could be taught. At 5 hours and 40 minutes, the Pale Margin's drives came online, not to move, but to power the surface event. Running dark means running cold, and surfacing means lighting everything up at once. The drives, the active arrays, the transmission suite, the full sensor profile. It's a loud moment after a long quiet. I heard it through my cockpit frame as a low vibration, a shiver through the hull, and then the Pale Margin came alive around me, and I felt it in my chest the way you feel large things. Surfacing in 40 seconds, Sova's voice said over the ship channel. Transmission is loaded. Full survey record broadcast on all Dominion communication bands, plus standard human first contact protocols in 63 language formats. I looked out at the drift. Surfacing, Sova said. And the pale margin said, here we are. The Dominion lead assessor's first response took 11 minutes to arrive, which was the time for a signal to travel from their formation to us and back. In those 11 minutes, Sova gave us a running analysis of what the Dominion formation was doing. The flanking arc had tightened, which was a defensive adjustment, not an aggressive one. The 3 unclassified hull types had moved to the rear of the formation. The main body had reduced velocity slightly. They're reading the transmission, Sova said. Active analysis on our signal. They're going through it. Tern stood at the central display and said nothing. The response, when it came, was a short transmission in a language that the pale margin's translation systems needed 40 seconds to render. What came out was formal and flat, the way automated official communications always are, stripped of inflection, stripped of context, leaving only the bare structure of the message. This corridor is sovereign Varek Dominion territory. You are present without authorization. You have transmitted unauthorized survey data within sovereign space. Identify your species designation, your technological classification, and your willingness to submit to Dominion assessment intake. Failure to comply within 30 minutes will result in enforcement action. Tern read it once. Then she sat down in the captain's chair, the first time I'd seen her sit since we surfaced, and she dictated her response without any visible pause to gather herself. This is Captain Yale Tern, commanding the ISV Pale Margin, on behalf of the Terran Ninth Fleet. Your survey of our species has been ongoing for the past 19 days. You were documented at 340,000 kilometers on initial detection. The survey record you received represents the full extent of our observation of your assessment formation, including drive signatures, hull classifications, power output readings, and tactical configuration for all 41 vessels currently in your formation. You are not assessing us. We have been assessing you. This corridor is a transit lane used by the Terran Ninth Fleet. We are present by right of prior use and established navigation. We will not yield the corridor. We will not submit to intake assessment. We invite continued communication and mutual survey in accordance with the first contact protocols included in our transmission. We do not seek conflict. We will not withdraw from conflict if it is brought to us. She stopped. She looked at Sova. Send it, she said. I launched at the 32-minute mark, 12 minutes before Dominion weapons range. Kavash launched 30 seconds behind me on the starboard bearing. We came out of the Pale Margin's dorsal cradles and swung wide, running on minimum emission, positioning ourselves at the outer edge of what would be the engagement perimeter if the Dominion came in. The Dominion came in. The Dominion lead assessor's second transmission arrived 9 minutes after Tern's response, at which point the formation had resumed its original velocity and was on a direct intercept bearing. The translation was brief. Your claims are not recognized. Compliance is required. Enforcement action will commence on contact. Tern read it on the bridge. Kavash and I received it through our fighter channels at the same moment. I remember reading it in the corner of my cockpit display while watching the amber markers on my tactical feed close the distance, slowly, methodically, the way a thing comes at you when it's never had a reason to hurry. Pale Margin, this is Davin, I said. We're in position. Davin, this is Tern. Hold your position. Do not engage until I give the order. Understood. The minutes between that transmission and the moment the Dominion crossed into engagement range were the longest I've spent in a cockpit. I've logged over 4,000 flight hours, and I've been in 3 combat deployments, and I've had longer engagements and more dangerous ones, and none of them felt as long as those minutes. I was watching the amber markers close. I was watching the pale margins transponder on my display, steady and bright. I was watching Kavash's transponder 30 kilometers off my starboard wing. I was thinking about what Kavash had said, that the survey ship was the statement, not the capability. And I was thinking about Turn's face when she said if they don't, we hold the corridor anyway. The Dominion formation crossed into engagement range at 9 hours and 4 minutes from initial detection, moving at a velocity that suggested they expected to halt and secure, not to fight. This is one of the things the survey record would later confirm. The Dominion's approach velocity was consistent with their intake protocols for non-resistant species. They were not coming in hot. They were coming in the way a bureaucratic process comes, organized, sequential, certain of its outcome. The lead assessment vessel opened fire at 9 hours and 11 minutes. I do not know what the assessment vessel's crew thought would happen. I think they thought the pale margin would break and run, the way the other 31 species had broken and run, or tried to. I think they thought the human ship would scatter when the first shots hit, because the first shots were calibrated to hit 2 medium-weight plasma strikes, the kind of thing that would cripple an unarmed vessel and demonstrate the futility of further resistance. That's how the intake enforcement protocol worked. Show them what you can do, show them there's no point, move in and secure. The pale margin took both strikes. I watched it on my tactical display, the bright signatures of the plasma rounds coming in, the bloom of the impact, the damage assessment running along the bottom of my screen. Forward sensor spine, compromised. Point defense cluster 1, offline. Hull breach in section C7 sealed. Crew casualties, 7. The pale margin shuddered under the impacts and her running lights flickered and then steadied, and she kept transmitting. She hadn't stopped transmitting since she surfaced. The survey record, the first contact protocols, the full documentation of the Dominion formation, all of it, going out on every available band, addressed to every receiver within signal range. Pale margin is holding, Sova's voice said, calm in the way trained people are calm when everything is going wrong. Transmitting. Captain Turn is injured. Commander Hellas has the con. Kavash Davin, I said, we're engaging. With you, Kavash said. A Kestrel-class interceptor is not designed to fight a 41-ship fleet. I want to be very clear about that. We were 2 fighters with standard armament, twin rail mounts, 1 missile hardpoint each, point defense systems that were more capable than the pale margins but still calibrated for anti-missile work. We were not a match for what was coming at us. What we were was faster. A Kestrel-class interceptor at full drive output runs at approximately 3 times the velocity of a Dominion assessment vessel's escort screen, and the Dominion escort screen had not been designed to track targets moving at our profile. The Dominion's 31 prior assessments had not included a contacted species with anything resembling our interceptor's performance envelope. Their fire control systems were optimized for the things they had seen before: slower vessels, conventional trajectories, the standard shapes of species that fought the way they were expected to fight. We did not fight the way they expected. The first pass was Kavash's design, which I recognized immediately and had practiced with him twice in the transit. He went in on the lead assessment vessel's starboard quarter on a crossing approach, forcing their escort screen to track a fast-moving target on a non-standard bearing. Their response was good, better than I'd expected, but their fire control had to slew across a wide arc to track him, and in the slew there was a gap. I came in through the gap at full drive, through the escort screen's response, and hit the lead vessel's sensor array with 2 rail mount bursts before their fire control could reacquire me. Not enough to destroy it, enough to degrade it, enough to tell them that the small fast things their systems were struggling to track were not going to stop. We came around for the second pass. Kavash went in first again, wider this time, pushing the escort screen's tracking arc further. I came in on the inside angle, tighter, inside the fire control's adjusted response. 2 more rail mount bursts to the lead vessel's communications array. One missile on a tight approach to an escort ship on the outer arc, proximity fused, catching the escort's sensor cluster and blinding it. The Dominion was adapting. I could see it in how the formation was shifting. The flanking arc was tightening in response to our approach angles, trying to reduce the gaps we were using. They were good. They had 31 assessments worth of enforcement experience, and they were learning our pattern inside the first 2 minutes of contact. The second pass was harder. I took a glancing hit from an escort ship's point defense system, not enough to damage the fighter structurally, but enough to take out my port rail mount and rattle the cockpit badly. I heard the impact through my suit and tasted copper, and I came around thinking about Kavash and where he was. Kavash status: intact, light damage to the starboard sensor array. I've still got both rail mounts and the missile hard point. Coming around for third pass on your mark. On my mark, I said. I watched him on my display. His transponder, steady, moving through the approach arc we designed for the third pass. He was going in tighter than the second pass, inside the adjusted escort screen, on the lead vessel's port quarter, which was the angle we'd identified as the weakest in their fire control coverage given the way the arc had tightened. It was more dangerous than the first 2 passes. It was the right move tactically, and I knew it and he knew it, and we discussed it in the briefing before launch. He went in. For 3 seconds, his transponder was inside the escort screen's coverage arc, moving fast on the lead vessel's port quarter, and I was watching it on my display, and I was already moving to my own approach angle, and the tactical feed was running its updates, and everything was tracking the way it was supposed to track. Then Kavash's transponder went dark. Clean cessation. No distress beacon. No ejection signature. The transponder code that had been present on my display for 22 days of transit and 31 minutes of engagement was simply absent. There was a marker where it had been, rendered in the amber that my system uses for lost contacts, and then the system cleared the marker and the space where Kavash had been was empty. I came out of my approach arc and I looked at the empty space on my display for longer than I should have. The engagement was still ongoing. The escort screen was realigning. The lead vessel's fire control was reacquiring me. The pale margin was still transmitting, still holding position, still adding to the broadcast record in real time. Everything was continuing. Only one thing had stopped. I came around for the third pass anyway. What I was doing was not rational, in the sense that the mathematics of the engagement had not changed. We were 2 fighters against 41 warships, and now we were 1 fighter against 41 warships. Nothing in the first 32 minutes of engagement had altered that underlying arithmetic. But Kavash was gone, and the pale margin was still transmitting, and Captain Tern was injured on a ship that was refusing to move, and the corridor was ours, and that had already been decided. I don't think not going to stop was a decision I made in that moment. I think it was something that had already been decided. The way Tern had already decided it before the Dominion fleet ever appeared. The way Kavash had already decided it when he told me quiet and serious in the crew mess that the survey ship was the statement. I think the Ninth Fleet had decided it when they assigned us to the pale margin. I think humanity had decided it somewhere back along the chain of decisions that led to building a ship like the pale margin and sending her into the Harith corridor with a crew of 61 and a pair of fighters, and the instruction to document what was here and hold what was ours. The Dominion assessment fleet had never met a species that had already decided. The third pass didn't go well. I lost my missile hardpoint on the approach and took structural damage to the starboard wing assembly. The interceptor was still flying, still fighting, but the performance envelope had narrowed considerably. I was no longer fast enough to run the crossing approach pattern reliably. I came around on a direct approach, which was not smart, and I knew it, and I did it anyway because the direct approach was what I had left and I was going to use what I had. The Dominion lead vessel's fire control was fully adjusted now. I was inside the engagement cone and taking fire, and I was going to die out here in the Harith corridor. And what I was thinking was that the pale margin was still transmitting, still broadcasting the survey record and the first contact protocols and the full documentation of the Dominion formation to every receiver within signal range. And the Dominion had to know by now that they had already been seen, already been recorded. That whatever they did in the next 60 seconds was going in the record and going out to everything that could receive it. The firing stopped. Not my guns, I hadn't stopped. The Dominion's guns stopped. The escort screen's weapons went cold. The lead assessment vessel's fire control array, which had been tracking me with the methodical precision of a system that had my profile fully resolved, went passive. I came out of the approach and swung wide, and looked at my tactical display. The formation was changing. The flanking arc had opened, not tightening, not closing for a final assault, but opening, the ships angling outward in the kind of movement that means a fleet is preparing to reverse course. The lead assessment vessel had reduced its velocity to near zero. The secondary mass was already turning. I watched it for a long time, longer than I needed to, because I didn't believe it at first. Then the mathematics caught up with the display. 41 ships, all of them moving onto withdrawal bearings, the formation dismantling its intake configuration and taking the shape of a fleet that is going home. Then I believed it. "Pale margin," I said. "Pale margin, this is Davin." "Davin, this is Commander Hellas." Hellas was the executive officer, a tall, quiet man from Kessel who I had spoken to maybe 4 times in 19 days. His voice was steady. "We see it. They're withdrawing." "Kavesh is gone," I said. A pause. "I know," Hellas said. "Come home, Lieutenant. I want to tell you what the Dominion's final transmission said, because I think it matters to the story, and I think it's been reported wrong in most of the accounts I've read." The transmission came in at 9 hours and 44 minutes, as the formation was completing its reversal. The pale margin's translation systems rendered it in the same flat official register as the first 2 transmissions, stripped of inflection, stripped of context, leaving only the structure. But this one was different in structure from the first 2. It said, "This corridor has been assessed. Assessment outcome, incomplete. Dominion intake protocol suspended pending senior review. This species has been logged at classification tier undetermined. The assessment record has been received and acknowledged. Further contact at designated forum. This transmission closes the Harath assessment." That's it. No acknowledgement that they'd been driven back. No concession that they'd lost anything. Pure bureaucratic formality. The language of a process that had encountered an anomaly it was routing upward for review. What the popular accounts got wrong was the implication. Most of them read it as the Dominion admitting defeat. That's not what it was. The Dominion was not admitting defeat. The Dominion was doing something far more significant, which was admitting that it didn't know what had just happened. 31 assessments and the protocol had never needed a senior review routing. The protocol was the review. The protocol was complete and sufficient. The protocol covered everything. Until us. Classification tier undetermined is the Dominion's filing notation for a contacted species that cannot be placed in the standard intake taxonomy. The taxonomy has 3 tiers: pre-contact primitives, contact-capable non-threats, and contact-capable threats requiring pacification. The taxonomy has been applied 31 times without an error, without a case it couldn't accommodate. We didn't fit. We sent a survey platform, not a warship. The survey platform refused to yield and refused to submit and took 2 plasma strikes and kept transmitting. 2 fighters held the flanking arc of a 41-ship fleet for 31 minutes. 1 fighter, after losing its wingman, continued the engagement alone on a direct approach into full fire control resolution. The Dominion had a tier for the species that runs. They had a tier for the species that fights and loses. They didn't have a tier for the species that fights and bleeds and pays the cost and doesn't stop, not because they don't know how much it costs. They know, they see the cost. They have it counted precisely. But because the corridor is theirs and they were here first, and that has already been decided. We brought the pale margin home to Meridian Station 46 days later, running at reduced drive output to protect the damaged hull sections. She had 41 crew when she arrived. She had launched with 61. 20 people in the engagement and the transit, injuries the medical bay couldn't hold far from any proper facility. We logged each of them. We carried them home in the ship's memorial record. We held a service in the pale margin's small observation bay, with the corridor still faintly visible behind us at extreme range, and I read 20 names in the same flat, precise way you read names when you want to say them right. Captain Tern was in the medical bay for most of the transit, recovering from the shrapnel she'd taken when the forward sensor spine collapsed. When she was cleared to leave the bay, about 10 days out from Meridian, she came to the observation deck late one evening. I was there. I was there most nights by then. The cell death drift was long behind us, but deep space has its own light and it was enough. Tern sat down next to me without ceremony, the way she did most things, and we were quiet for a while. The silence between us was the kind that had been built up over 40 days of transit, and was comfortable in the way that silences are when both people understand what's in them. "You want to know why I requested the assignment?" she said. "Yes." The Ninth Fleet's assessment said the Dominion would probably stand down if we held the corridor and broadcast the survey record. The logic was that they operate on intake protocols, and the intake protocols depend on the contacted species having no prior intelligence on the Dominion formation. If we stripped that advantage away, if we showed them, in the first transmission, that we'd already mapped them, that they were already in the record, that anything they did in the corridor was being documented and broadcast to every receiver in range, then the cost-benefit calculus of an enforcement action changed. "The calculus changed," I said. "The intelligence section gave it a 72% probability of stand-down without engagement," Tern said, "conditional on us holding position and not yielding the corridor under fire." "And the other 28%? "The other 28% was that they fire anyway, and we take heavy casualties, and the fleet uses the engagement record to build a deterrent case for the Harith corridor." I looked out at the stars. "You brought 61 people into a 28% chance of this." "I brought 61 people who understood the assignment," Tern said. "Everyone on this ship was a volunteer. I made sure of that before we departed. They all had the intelligence assessment. They all knew the numbers." I thought about Kavesh sitting next to me in the crew mess, turning his coffee cup in his slow rotation, saying the survey ship was the statement, saying we have guns in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who understands exactly what that means. "He knew," I said. "Yes," Tern said. We were quiet for a while. "The Dominion will come back," I said. "Not immediately, but eventually. They're going to want to resolve the classification tier undetermined notation. They're a filing system with a fleet attached. They can't leave a case open." "They'll come back to a different corridor," Tern said. "A designated forum. Their transmission said so. And we'll meet them there." "We'll meet them there," Tern said, "with more than 2 fighters and a survey ship." I thought about what that meeting would look like. I thought about the Ninth Fleet's full combat inventory, the carriers and the dreadnoughts and the cruiser squadrons and the deep space platforms, and all the accumulated weight of 200 years of building ships for the kind of space that requires ships like that. I thought about the Dominion commander, sitting on his assessment vessel, watching a single interceptor come at him on a direct approach after 31 minutes of engagement with no wingman and a half-functional weapons load, and I wondered what word the Dominion had for that. Maybe they didn't have one. Maybe that was the point. The pale margin was decommissioned 8 months after we returned to Meridian Station. The structural damage from the plasma strikes was repairable, but the forward sensor spine had taken damage at the mounting points that the engineers couldn't certify for another long-range run. She was stripped of her systems, and the hull was retired to the Meridian salvage yard. I went to see her before they stripped her. It was a cold day at the station. The environmental systems were running a seasonal cycle that kept the outer bays at something approximating autumn temperatures, and there was a thin haze of condensation on the hull when I walked up to her. She looked smaller in the salvage yard than she had in space. They all do. The context is different. In space, there's nothing to compare her to, and she exists at the scale she exists at, which is enormous and strange, and in its own way beautiful. In the salvage yard, she was a damaged ship surrounded by other damaged ships, and the scale of her was available to measure against other things. The sensor spine was gone, removed in sections, the mounting points cleaned back to bare hull. The hull breach in C7 had been sealed with a matte gray patch that stood out against the original hull coating. There were char marks on the forward section from the plasma strikes, dark streaks against the absorbent composite that had been her signature running dark. She looked used, the way ships look when they've been through something real. I put my hand on the hull. The composite was cold under my palm. I stood there for a while thinking about Kavash and the other 19. What it means to make a decision you can't take back. What it means to understand the cost and go anyway, not because you don't feel it, not because you've done some calculus that makes the cost acceptable, but because you've already decided and the deciding doesn't stop when the bill comes. I thought about the observation bay and the cell death drift glowing faintly blue and Kavash saying the survey ship is the statement and being right about that in a way that I didn't fully understand until I was standing in the salvage yard with my hand on the hull of a decommissioned ship watching condensation bead on the char marks. She'd held, that's the thing, under 2 plasma strikes that would have ended most ships, with her captain down and her forward sensor spine compromised and her point defense offline. She'd held the corridor and kept transmitting and not moved. Not because she was indestructible. She was the opposite of indestructible. She was a scientific platform with no guns. She was the wrong ship for the engagement by every metric that matters. But Tern had asked for her specifically, and the crew had volunteered specifically, and the pale margin had been built to know things, and she'd known this. The corridor was ours, and that had been decided. I thought about the other ships in the salvage yard, the ones I'd seen on the walk from the gate. Combat vessels, most of them patrol craft, a destroyer with her drive section sheared off, a frigate whose midship section showed the geometry of a catastrophic internal failure, ships that had fought and been broken. The pale margin was different from them in a way I hadn't been able to articulate until I was standing next to her. She hadn't been broken. She'd been used up. There's a difference. A broken ship ends in a fight it lost. A used-up ship ends in a fight it completed. She'd done what she came to do. She'd known the Dominion fleet before it knew her. She'd broadcast that knowledge to everything in range. She'd held the corridor until the Dominion went home. Then she'd gotten her 41 surviving crew members back to Meridian Station, and she'd done it at reduced drive output because her hull wasn't rated for full thrust anymore, and she'd known that too, and she'd managed it anyway. I took my hand off the hull. The cold stayed in my palm for a while. I walked back to the station and I wrote Kavash's family a letter which I'd been drafting and not finishing for 8 months. I finished it that day. I told them he understood what the assignment was. I told them he designed the first 2 engagement passes and that the first pass opened the gap that kept the pale margin's record running. I told them the corridor held. I don't know if that was what they needed to hear. It was what was true. The Dominion sent their formal contact delegation to the Harith Station proceedings 14 months later. I was not part of the diplomatic mission. That was not my role, and it was not something I wanted. I read the summaries. I know what happened. The Dominion delegation came with a translation team, a survey of their own conduct documentation, and a formal inquiry into what the pale margin's engagement record contained. They had read it many times, apparently. They had circulated it through their senior review process and arrived at a conclusion that they communicated in the first session of the proceedings. The conclusion, rendered through the translation system. The classification tier for this species is unresolved and requires a new designation category. We have not previously encountered a contacted species that transmitted a full survey of our formation at first contact. We have not previously encountered a contacted species that held an assessment corridor under fire with non-combat vessels. We have not previously encountered a contacted species whose escort element engaged our assessment fleet on a direct approach after losing tactical advantage. We are unclear on the appropriate intake protocol for a species with this profile. We are requesting guidance. The diplomatic mission's lead officer, Counselor Des Arvin, reportedly paused for a considerable time before responding. What she said was, "We don't have an intake protocol, we have a conversation." The Dominion delegation sat with that for several minutes. Then they said, "This is a different kind of contact." And Arvin said, "Yes. I think about the Harith corridor differently now than I did 22 years ago. In the months after we returned, I thought about it in terms of what it had cost. The 20 people, Kavash's voice going quiet, the pale margin's hull singing under 2 plasma strikes and the lights flickering and the survey record going out on every band. I thought about whether it was worth it, which is a question you ask when you're 29 years old and you've just watched your wingman's transponder go dark, and you're still not entirely sure how you got home. Now I think about it differently. Now I think about the Dominion's senior review board, somewhere in the heart of their assessment apparatus, reading the engagement record from the Harith corridor for the first time, reading the part where the pale margin surfaced and transmitted her full survey of the formation and refused to yield, reading the part where 2 interceptors held the flanking arc for 31 minutes, reading the part where 1 interceptor came in on a direct approach with 1 working rail mount and took the fire and kept going. I think about the board member who had to write the notation, classification tier, undetermined. I think about what that notation means in a filing system that has processed 31 species without an error. The taxonomy is complete and sufficient. The taxonomy covers everything, except it doesn't cover this. It doesn't have a tier for a species that prices the cost in advance and pays it anyway, not because they don't feel it, not because they don't understand what they're losing, they feel it precisely, they understand it completely, but because they've already decided and the deciding doesn't stop when the cost arrives. The Dominion had a word for conquest. They'd built their entire civilization around it. 31 assessments, 31 species processed through the intake taxonomy, 31 neat entries in the record. They understood conquest. They knew exactly what it was. They had never done it to a species that looked back. That's what they found in the Harith corridor. Not a fleet, not an arsenal. A survey ship and 2 fighters and 61 people who had read the numbers and shown up anyway, who kept the record running when the strikes hit and kept the approach vector when the tactical math said stop, who paid what it cost because the corridor was theirs, and that had already been decided before the first amber marker appeared on the passive arrays. I carry the 20 people with me. I'll carry them for the rest of my life and I'll never fully account for them, and I know that. But I also carry this. The Dominion opened a new file. The first new file in 31 assessments, the first case the taxonomy couldn't close. It sits in their record now, open, unresolved, waiting. Classification tier, undetermined. The corridor held.